This is a car that I weathered a few years ago. I want to weather another one kind of like it. Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi, and welcome to a new show I'm doing called Painting and Weathering. As you might guess from the title, it's going to be about painting and weathering models. For my first subject, I chose a boxcar. Now, because this got to be a little bit long, I decided to break it up into more than one part. In this first episode, I'm going to talk about what I'm trying to accomplish, how I prepare the model, and then doing a couple of different techniques for fading the paint. So let's get started. In this episode, I'm going to be weathering this Branchline Berwick boxcar that's decorated for Peninsula Terminal. I built this car from a kit, and it's almost complete. I did leave off a few parts since I knew I was going to be weathering it, like the grab irons and things, so I'll attach those later. So if you're curious about building the actual kit, I did a video on model building on vacation a while back, and I built this car, which is identical except for the paint job. You can find that here on the channel. So I did some research on this car, and I discovered that Peninsula Terminal had cars painted like this, but they didn't seem to have any actual Berwicks. So this car is actually a Fubi, meaning that the body style and paint job don't match. So my thought was to remove the Peninsula Terminal lettering and then make it look like a car from one of the other railroads like St. Lawrence that actually did have these. Unfortunately, on this car, removing the lettering is not an easy task because the paint is super thin. There's different techniques for removing lettering from a model. Like on an Athearn locomotive, I might use microset and let the decal fluid soak on the numbers for a while and then gently rub them or use some tape to lift them off, and that actually works on Athearn. It doesn't work on every model. Did not work on this model. So my last resort was sandpaper, which is not really something I'd recommend because it's pretty harsh. And in this case, it actually left the letter but took off the paint underneath, which is exactly the opposite of what I was trying to do. So in spite of that, I'm going to continue sanding because my thought now is to repaint the panels partly where the lettering is. And I want to make sure that the lettering isn't going to show through. So I want to try to sand the letters so that there's no visible edges once they're painted over, if that makes sense. I want to not have ghost lettering. If this was a more authentic car, the ghost lettering might actually be a cool idea, but I want to just get rid of it completely on this car. So I have some of these sanding sticks that I got from Micromark, I think, some time ago, and they come in different grits. So I'm going to try to use one of these since I can control the area of sanding pretty well with this. It's a little easier than trying to cut a small piece of sandpaper to fit in between the ribs of the boxcar. So this is a little bit slow going, so I think I'm going to fast forward a little bit so that the video is not too boring. I think the best way maybe to see what's happening as I'm sanding is to look at the sheen. You can see as it catches the light there, you can see where I've sanded the panels. So it's actually polishing more than sanding. I've switched to a little bit more aggressive grit to see if I can actually get some of the letters off a little better. And we'll just do this for a while. Sometimes it's hard to tell if anything's happening, but then I can see that there's blue paint on my sanding stick, so I know something's going on. So I think I've sanded this car as much as I dared to. This is the first side that I showed. And then this is the other side. So not looking too bad. There's a couple spots like here where the sanding stick took some of the paint off the ribs, so I'm going to have to touch that up as well. So I think this car is ready for the paint booth. Now I should mention that my goal is not to try to match the blue exactly. What I want to do is to try to use a blue that is going to make this look a little bit faded. When I built this car, I didn't glue the roof on, so I'm going to go ahead and take that off and set it aside. That'll make it a little easier to deal with when painting. I painted the wheels on this car using the same techniques I used in my weathering base coat video. So I'm removing each truck one at a time. This car has already been worked on in terms of coupler height, so I have to make sure that I don't mix these up. I put some tape on each truck and labeled them A and B so that I can get them back in the right places later. In the photos I've been looking at, most of this tiny writing on the car is completely obliterated or it's faded away and you can't see it anymore. So I'm not really worried about that. However, the car did still have its lube stencil and the wheel inspection dot, so I've taped over those with some blue tape so that everything I do from now on won't obliterate those. So my goal with this is not to reproduce a specific car, but to make something that looks very plausible. And I found a photo of one car where the entire car is kind of faded to a very light blue, but then there are irregular patches up here in the area where this lettering is that are a slightly darker blue. And I thought that was kind of cool, so I think I'm going to try to do that. So I'll bring back this other car for a second, because I also want to patch the car that I'm working on, kind of like this. And I saw one, actually the same car I was looking at with the two different colors of blue on it, had two different patch colors and then these kind of stencil letters over it. So that's what I'm going to do with that. I'll probably leave the little reflector strips off though, because this is kind of a post-2005 thing, and I want the car that I'm working on to look like it might have been plausible for the 90s. It's kind of a last-minute thing before I take the car out to paint it. I did also mask the couplers. You know, these draft gear boxes are the kind that aren't easy to take apart, so rather than try to do that, I just leave the couplers on the car and tape them. So to fade the paint, I'm going to use this Tester's Flat Sky Blue color. And as you can see, it's considerably lighter than the blue that's on the car. I'm spraying the Tester's paint thin with a couple of drops of paint thinner. I'm putting several light coats on the car, and I'm also hitting the uncoupling levers since those weren't painted. So this is what the car looks like now. I'm not super thrilled with the Tester's paint. For one thing, it's glossy when it was supposed to be flat. That's okay though, that actually might be an advantage. The other thing that bothers me is it has a little bit of an orange peel texture, but I'm hoping that'll go away once I continue to weather the car. It did lighten it up quite a bit, so that's good. Not quite as much as I was hoping, but that's okay. So now that I'm done spraying the blue, I'll go ahead and pull off the masking. Looked like this worked pretty well. You know, one thing I'll say in terms of, like, some people have trouble with paint creeping under tape when you mask. And the trick is to use really thin coats, because when you're airbrushing, the paint will dry real fast usually when it comes out of the airbrush if you put it on thin. And, you know, the reason why you get that creep effect is if the paint is wet against the edge of the tape, and then capillary action draws it underneath. But if the paint is dry, it can't go anywhere. So some of the cars in the photos I've found, even though it's many years later after these were no longer used, still have ACI labels. So I want to put a couple of those on my car, and I'm going to use microscale sheet MC4280. So this is where the gloss finish that ended up on the car is kind of a benefit, as it's easier to put decals over gloss. Just to minimize the chances of any silvering around the edges, I've cut this as close as I could to the actual color part of the decal. Use a little water to get it wet. With really small decals, sometimes I just put them right on the model. That way I don't have to worry about trying to get them on the model. I use a little micro set in the area where I want the decal to go. That kind of preps the surface. Okay, it took it a few seconds to loosen up. There it is. Just keep the brush wet with some micro set and get rid of the paper. And then I'll just kind of position it where I want it. That looks pretty good. So now that the decal is where I want it and it's had a chance to dry for a minute, I'll use some microsol to soften it. Just kind of dab it on a little bit. Can always put on more later, but the very first time I like to be really gentle so I don't move it. So microsol is a softening agent. It softens the decal and makes it conform to the paint. So it's very important that once you put the microsol on, you don't attempt to move the decal again, because it will basically just fall apart. So just in case there's any confusion, microset is a wetting agent. You use that to position the decal. And you can use that repeatedly if you want to. You can refloat a decal with microset if it's not in the right place. Once you get the decal where you want it though, and you're sure that's where you want it, then you put on the microsol and that softens it. So microsol is actually kind of a solvent that dissolves the decal into the paint and makes it really, you know, get down in there over all the orange peel and everything. And so once you've put microsol on it, you don't want to move it again. So that's the difference. Microset first, then the decal, then microsol when you're ready to make it stay where it's going to be forever. So this is looking pretty good. I don't see any silvering around the edges. The decal itself's a little shiny, but I'll tone that down when I tone down the rest of the car. So in looking at photos of this car, I noticed that the car body itself is more weathered than some of the other patches that I need to paint. So I thought I would go ahead and try to do a little weathering on the car as kind of a preliminary step. And I want to try this wet on wet technique that I've seen some other people do, including Boomer Diorama. If you haven't seen that channel, you should check it out. It does some really neat stuff. I've wet the car down with a mixture of water and with a little bit of Windex added to kind of cut some of the surface tension. One of the things that always bothers me about washes is when you get like outlines of full-size drops on the surface of the car. I'm using a big brush just to keep the surface wet. And I get a little bit of Vallejo burnt umber. Just kind of let it flow in there. Let me blend it. I want this to be subtle, not too heavy-handed. I like how it builds up and makes little kind of shadows around the ribs. That looks pretty cool. I think keeping the whole thing wet will hopefully keep it from having that water droplet effect that I'm not crazy about. So when you tip the car up, the water runs to the bottom. If it's too heavy, you can take the brush after kind of cleaning it a little bit and just wick some of it off. You know, I always prefer a little more subtle than overdone, so I think that's looking not too bad. All right, so the effect is pretty subtle, but I like it. There's actually kind of a little bit of a gradient happening on the car. I kind of like that effect. It's lighter on the top and darker on the bottom. It's kind of the direction I want to head in. I did take this outside and spray it with some Tamiya Clear Flat to seal it. And now we can continue with the weathering. So these are some pan pastels, and this is actually a weathering kit that they sell, which has a lot of rusty and earth tones in it, which is what people normally think of when they do weathering. So I also got this set, and I think it's actually intended for artists who want to do like flower pictures. You might be wondering why I got this. Mostly for this light blue color here. You know, when I did the base coat weathering video, I kind of talked about paying attention to the color of the model when you're selecting things to weather it with, but I didn't really elaborate. But I think this could make some interesting streaking effects on this car. I wouldn't use it on a red car or a yellow car or a brown car, but I think on this light blue car, this might be just the thing. So the car I was looking at has some streaking that goes down even over the markings. I just want to see how this might work. That seems a little heavy-handed right now. All right, so I figured out that you streak it on, and then I can use a little bit of water just on my finger and kind of rub some of it off. And then take a big soft brush and blend it. You can always apply more if you want. There's actually very little on the applicator right now. But it's producing a nice subtle streaking effect that I like. And you notice I'm going over the decal I just put on too. That's okay though. I want it to look like some of the paint is kind of maybe worn away and streaked down over the markings. So what happens if we blend it without water? Well, that's not bad either. Sorry, my hand's in the way. It's actually even more of an effect. So this is definitely kind of cool. I like this. Very subtle. But it's starting to have that real faded and weather-beaten look that I really like for this, at least that I had in mind for this particular car. This brush has fairly stiff bristles. I think too soft of a brush I don't think would work as well. Yeah, I like that a lot. The nice thing about this too is this is a dry medium. So you can, like, I could stop now and leave this car for however long I wanted to and then come back to it later, and there's not like a real urgency to finish it right away because you're worried about something drying. You can just, do it at your leisure. Yeah, I think I might like it better just using it dry rather than trying to take some off with water. Although it's good to know that you can take it off with water if you want. Not everything that you use for weathering can be easily removed, so sometimes using stuff that is water soluble is an advantage, in case you make a mistake. Don't forget the ends. I almost did, and that would look really weird. Gotta be a little careful not to damage any of the details while doing this. These blend really nicely. They seem to be fairly, if you get it wet, obviously it's going to maybe come off, but it doesn't seem like it would just like fall off like regular pastels can. So one of the nice things about pan pastels versus like grinding up regular pastels and using those to weather something is that when you clear coat it, the pan pastels stay. And you can still see it. A lot of times when you clear coat regular pastels, they kind of disappear. But I sprayed this car again with some Tamiya Clear Flat, and the fading is still there. So that's pretty cool. I hope you're enjoying following along with my project so far. I'm kind of excited to see how it turns out. If you enjoyed this video, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned, and thanks for watching.